Good afternoon. I'm George Latimer, Westchester County Executive. I'm joined by Westchester County Legislator Kitley, Covill, who represents this area of Westchester County, Peter Tartaglia, who's our Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Conservation, and Jason Klein, who's also Senior Manager in that department. We're here at the historic Merestead facility, and if you've followed the last number of weeks, we've had a series of meetings, press conferences, and announcements that relate to the Westchester County Park system. We had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to show you the opening of Sprain Ridge Pool, the first pool, and we're working on the second pool. We had the opportunity to bring you to Playland to show you what our plans are there, adding a ride and so forth. And in the weeks to come, we have some other announcements to make on Maple Moor Golf Course, which is reopened, and elsewhere. Westchester County has over 50 parks. They're very diverse all across Westchester County, other different holdings. We have farms and a number of different operating facilities that serve different purposes. And this is one of the holdings that we have, the Merestead property. And we're here to talk about what we have today and the direction in which we hope to go. And much of this is because of the legislative advocacy of Legislator Covill, who has been a strong advocate for us to get a game plan in place on Merestead and to move forward. Just to give you a little bit of the history of this, you're going to get a chance to take a tour. The tour will be much more interesting. Gigi Carnes, who's with us here, will make sure that you know anything about the history of this building. This is the former estate of Mrs. Margaret Sloan Patterson, who's the daughter of William Sloan, who's president of W&J Sloan, and she's the wife of Dr. Robert Patterson, a prominent orthopedic surgeon in New York City. Very prominent individuals. This is a 28-room Georgian mansion with beautiful gardens. It was built in the early 20th century. We tried to make this the official home of the county executive. That didn't go very far, but I'm happy to be a visitor, as you are. In 1982, the Pattersons deeded the property to Westchester County upon Mrs. Patterson's death, which occurred in August of 2000. Westchester took full possession of the property at that time. However, now we're going to be taking some action steps going forward to begin the process of the repairs that are needed for this property. We want this property to be usable in a way that can help generate revenue and can also be the kind of facility that people can come and enjoy as a prominent homestead and as a prominent site for different type of activities. There'll be some questions that we'll try to answer in some greater detail. When we received this property, there were a variety of deed restrictions on it. And while those deed restrictions represent the original intent of the ownership of it, some of these deed restrictions creates a problem in us being able to use the property in an intelligent way and retain it. We don't have the right under the current deed restrictions to have a gift shop here, which would be a very logical thing to do to generate money to have items that could be purchased as part of that process. We're prescribed from having weddings at the property, and this is a beautiful homestead. You can see immediately how valuable it would be for certain brides and grooms to have as a setting like this with 130 acres here. So we filed a petition for equitable deviation of an indenture. You know, I don't know what this is. I'm just repeating these words. But the bottom line is we filed a document in Westchester Supreme Court that will help modify those restrictions so that we can use the property appropriately to protect it and appropriately to show its beauty as it was in the days of the Sloan and the Patterson family, but also to be able to generate revenue, because our initial intent here is not to immediately use tax revenue to do things here, but to try to use some resources that exist within the property, apply that to some of the needs that we have here, and then once we get this to a level of stabilization, then to have a generation of revenue that will allow us to do more with the property. There are a host of specifics I think might be better for me to explain in one-on-one settings, and perhaps Pete Tartaglia can do that in a little bit more detail. But the driving force behind the desire to maintain this comes from Legislator Kitley Covill, who represents this area, the 4, 5, 6 communities in northeastern Westchester, and she has her finger on the pulse of the community here, which wants to see us save this property and restore it. So, Legislator Covill, your thoughts.
Thank you. When I came here, I was shocked to see what a beautiful jewel we had in the park system that had been neglected for a long time. And as you go on the tour, you will see that. So part of my thinking was that we could fix this, but it would not be right to put what it would cost to bring this back on the taxpayer's dollar. So Westchester County is using a bond to fix the roof and some of the outside, but we decided we would go into court and ask for some relief. So when Mrs. Patterson died, there was a trust fund, but it was very restricted in terms of the amount we could use. So we're asking the court to relieve us from that restriction, which is right now currently about $4.2 million. We are also asking the court to relieve of some of the restrictions and the required uses. For example, in the deed and will, it required us to feed deer. I don't think we need to feed the deer. But there are a lot of other things that were restrictive in terms of use. Preserve everything just the way it was. Well, we don't live like we lived back in the early 20th century. So we're looking to have some of those restrictions lifted so we can use it for different kinds of events. And the last thing we're going to do is sell a few pieces in the collection that are valuable but cannot be preserved appropriately in a setting like this. So we're hoping that the court will look favorably upon this application and will grant us the relief we are seeking. So that's kind of what I advocated for and where we are today. So I'm hopeful that we will bring this beautiful place back to where it should be. But I will leave it to our Deputy Parks Commissioner to explain a little more about that.
Thank you, everybody. We couldn't be here without the support of the county executive and the board of legislators. And thank you to George and to Kitley on behalf of Kathy O'Connor and myself and the staff here. Evie Lopez does a great job in keeping this building where it is and the other structures here in the beautiful grounds. And Jason Klein is the Director of Conservation. This is a park, and we thank the Patterson family for making this, allowing us to make this a park. But with that, some of the things that were said previously, we want to make this place flourish and be usable to more of the public for many different uses. There's a wonderful trail system outside, beautiful outdoors that people can walk and use during dawn to dusk hours year-round. The house here and some of the other buildings is where the attention is needed, and you might have seen the roadway on the way up. There are things that need to be done here. So we are trying to do a co-partnership with both some capital funding with the county as well as through the deed. We're always going to protect a park. That's our job. So some of the restrictions that we're asking to be lifted are not, we don't consider them too onerous. We could even do filming in here. I mean, we do a lot of filming with the Office of Tourism. They film in all of our parks. And when that happens, people notice and they go, I know that place. And then there's interest. So then we use that interest and build on it, whether it's social media or through other means to have use here. We are already having weddings at Lasden Park, at Mountain Lakes, and at some other locations. This would be a wonderful place for that as well. So some of the work that is going to be done here is mostly exterior. That's the first part of this. It will be exterior work, basically roofing, windows, stone on the, brick on the outside, and all the exterior work. And from there, we're going to try to move forward with the family, the court, and county executive and legislatures to get to the next step. So what we'd like to do, now if you have questions now or later, we'd like to just give you a little tour of what goes on in the house, because it is a beautiful place. I mean, it's as rich in history as some of our other locations, Miller House, Playland, the Whiteman Estate, all these other places that we have.
Peter, is filming allowed here currently?
No, it is not.
It's not, okay. And Mr. County Executive, if I could ask you, what are you trying to balance here? Because it's obviously a tremendous asset, but you're also very sensitive to how the tax dollars are spent. What are you trying to balance?
Well, I think, Tony, you've identified what it is. We have an asset here, and we don't want to see the asset devalued, but at the same time, we recognize that we don't have unlimited funds. We had conversation earlier this week about seeking funds to do certain essential things. And if there's a thread that ties through everything you've seen in the last few weeks and where we are at the Miller House and where we are with some of the other holdings, is that we're trying to be proactive. We're not going to let our assets deteriorate, but we also don't think that automatically it means an infusion of government money in every single situation. In the case of the Miller House, the state partnered with us for some resources. In the case of Playland, we believe there's a revenue generation reality when we bring a new ride in. In this case, we're seeing the potential for revenue generation, weddings and filming and some of these other things. But we want you to see what this is, so this gives you an idea of how we're trying to be creative for this. And as we go forward, we'll have further conversations about where we're going to be with Hilltop Hanover over in Yorktown, what the future holds for Muscoot, Lasden, each of these different facilities. And I think that represents our philosophy that we want to be proactive, but not necessarily that there's a government solution for every one of these things. But we'll have to evolve, and I think we all understand that we're looking at a phase 1 response now, and a phase 2 and a phase 3 is yet to be determined.
And just finally, for me, have you had any preliminary discussions with the surviving members of the Patterson family as to whether they're okay with?
Have you had the most recent contact?
Yes, so I've been through this house with her, thank you for asking that. There's only one surviving issue, who, of course, really doesn't have a say, but we, of course, also would love because she has the living memory. So we've been through the house several times, we've talked about what we could do with this house. She is fine with selling some of the collection. She identified the pieces that she thought were appropriate. So we have been working nicely with the remaining heir, I guess, but she's not an heir, I forget, remaining child.
Any other questions for us as a group before we start the tour around? Ally?
There was a 4.2 million number thrown out. Can you just clarify what that is and what, do you want to talk about that?
Well, we're in the process.
Like how much?
I'm sorry. We're in the process. Bids are out right now, so we're in the process.
No, not the bond.
Oh, the
This is
bond.
trust.
Oh, the trust is, I think, 4.3
Or,
million.
well, it fluctuates.
It
but
fluctuates
yes.
because
So
it.
that's what you are allowed to use?
No.
No, we're not allowed to
This
use
is what was
it.
set aside for us by the family
Yes.
as part of when they deeded, let me go on the microphone.
Yes. I'm sorry.
When they deeded the property to us, they had a certain amount of resources which went with it in order to maintain and upkeep the facility. Now, a certain amount of time passed between the original deeding and when the last surviving member, Mrs. Patterson, died. That gap of time meant that the property deteriorated some. And now we are, at this point, almost 20 years since the passage of Mrs. Patterson. And, there have been other administrations, other boards of legislators that have been here. There's been a constant debate about what to do with this. In that regard, it is exactly the same situation as the Miller House, Washington headquarters. A debate occurred in prior years. What are we going to do? We don't know. In the meantime, Miller House deteriorates. What are we going to do with Sprain Ridge pools? I don't know. Maybe we'll do nothing, and it deteriorates. Same situation here. And so we're taking basically, if you want to tie the theme through, we're being proactive. We're not going to let this house just continue to deteriorate. We're going to try to put it on a path. And the 4.3 million represents what's been set aside. Now, that's not enough to do the things that we need to do prospectively, which is why we want to change the deed restrictions so that we can generate revenue in this house. And as you see, as you go through it, we're going to have plan appropriate activities for here, not things that will, churn up or chew up the physicality of the house. But again, if you can imagine, what a nice wedding would look like here, what it would look like if, some entity wanted to film a show, television show here once everything is at the top peak, and that generates revenue. That will be revenue in addition to the 4.3 before we even touch any tax levy.
Has the 4.3 been throwing off a little bit of interest income every year?
So let me just, to that point, the restrictions in the deed did not let us touch much of that. So we were only getting a little bit out of there. That's why it remains still intact and why we've asked the courts to relieve us from that little 2%, 3%. They're in two different funds, so that we can actually use the bulk of it now to fix the house up. So it has thrown off some interest. It has not been able to actually sustain the amount of park resources that have been allocated here. So it has been a loss loser anyway. And then, of course, it didn't allow us to do real capital projects here.
Any other questions? Yes.
If you can elaborate, I understand some of the activities you hope that will be able to be hosted here. Can you elaborate what the house is currently used for, just so we have something to compare it to?
Peter, Jason?
Sure. We have, the Copeland House has concerts here several times a year. And there is tours here very occasionally, not very often at this point.
You should say those concerts are chamber music.
Yes, they're chamber music. I'm sorry, it's Aaron Copeland House. I'm sorry, it's classical and chamber music held inside the house. There's several of those a year. And most of the other activity is really outside on the grounds. It's open to the public. The entire facility, like any of our parks, is open to the public from dawn to dusk. The idea is here, and what the county executive and what Legislator Covill said is, we're going to do anything, we're not going to do anything. It's gone on for 19 years, so it's almost 20 years, and we're now at the point of having the support to try to get this house fixed and some of the other buildings on the property so that we can make this into a very active park.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Before we start the tour, let me just close by drawing an analogy. If you're ever in Rye on the Boston Post Road, as you're going south out of the heart of Rye, just before you cross into Mamaroneck, you'll see off to the left a a significant-looking estate. It's known as the Jay Estate. The building itself relates to Peter Jay, who was the son of John Jay being one of the founding fathers of the country. In 1987 or 88, the owners of that property went to the Rise City Planning Board and got approval to build 29 houses. They would have torn down the historic Jay property, the carriage house, and some other outbuildings, and there was a hue and cry to try to save that historic homestead from being torn down. And of course, it had the history that tracks back not just to the turn of the prior century, but back to the colonial era. And there was a major effort done. The state put in significant money. The county put in money. I was a Rise City councilman at the time, and the Jay property was saved. You go by that property now, you look at it, and the way that the Jay Heritage Foundation has found private resources to go into that facility to maintain it, to have certain programs, both historical programs and other types of entertainment. The land around that is county-owned and is added to the Marshlands Estate, which has an environmental element to it. That was a creative way 20 years ago, almost in the same time frame, probably 30 years ago, prior to the time frame to this property. You drive past that property, and I tend to do it almost every day because of where I live and where I travel, and just imagine that that would be lost forever, and 29, very nice homes would have been put in its place. That is what we avoid doing by saving this property. We save a piece of our heritage. We do it in a way that allows for there to be a public involvement and access to this, and we show that we value these things. We value the history and the tradition of these facilities. This county, and I'm going on now, but this county has done things that no other county has done. First limited access highway, Bronx River Parkway. First planned amusement park, Playland. The Kensico Dam, the Kensico Dam Plaza. Even the airport, a lot of innovative things, county center, things that this county has done that others didn't do, because we valued the past and we figured out how to protect the past and not necessarily make it extra burdensome. And I think that's the story of today. This is a wonderful asset. It's a beautiful homestead. It was given to us by a family. How we use those assets to help preserve it and where we go forward is what our mission is. And we see us as having a fiduciary responsibility, but also a stewardship responsibility. And that's what we're fully accepting, that we're going to go forward and find a path so that this magnificent homestead can still be alive and can still be used and appreciated by the people of this county. Because while we understand the cost of everything, we also understand the value of everything. With that, lead us on. You want to follow up? Sure.
The fact that this building is on the National Registry of Historic Places, does that add a level of scrutiny, a level of expense, a level of difficulty?
It does. It does. Anytime, as you know, absolutely a good point, Tony. It does make things more expensive to fix. You have to make sure that it is done to a certain level, and it's not even so much that you have to maintain it so that it looks like it might have looked, but the actual products you use have to mirror that. And we're going through that right now in the Miller House, which is a much smaller version of things. So it does add some cost to it. It makes it a little more problematic. On the other hand, what we find, and this is true if you think of things that are not necessarily owned by the county, Lyndhurst, Van Cortlandt Manor, Sunnyside, these things that have historic value attract tourism. They attract people to come. They come and they tour the facilities, they pay to tour the facilities, and then they eat in our restaurants and stay overnight in our hotels. So whatever the long-term future of Merestead is, and as we start where we are today and we start to move forward on it, that's the potential that if we do, in fact, maintain this to project a certain time and place in American and architecture and American life, that it will have an attraction to it that people will follow. All right, so we're going to stop. Any other questions? You can certainly ask along the tour. Ask Peter and Jason operationally, Kitley in terms of the pulse of the community, and we're happy to have you here. And thank you for following us.